All right, and we're live. Welcome back, everyone. Attorney Craig Stager here today. So I'm live streaming to TikTok. I'm also on YouTube and LinkedIn today because I think this is sort of an interesting topic. So for those of you that don't know, you can in most states you can get your commercial driver's license at age 18, but you can't actually drive across state lines, which we call interstate travel. I don't think you can do that in any state until you're 21. But you can drive intrastate. So if you have a commercial driver's license in a state, you can typically drive within that state um, validly from 18 to 21. And I was really curious about why that is. So I was doing some researching and I wanted to kind of get people's feedback on that, especially truckers out there. I was a late bloomer. I didn't get my license until I was in my late 40s, so that's not an issue for me. But I have one of my sons just got his commercial driver's license out of high school, so he's 18, and he's found it challenging to find places that can hire him because of his age. And I know from talking to other people online, Reddit and whatnot, that that is a common issue. So I wanted to talk about it, and then if people have feedback on whether it makes sense to maintain that rule, which has been around for a while. So I want to talk about the history of the rule, and then we'll talk about maybe some of the pros and cons and see what people think about it. So the rule began in 1986. So in 1986, the federal government issued the Commercial Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1986. And I was wondering if the rule on limiting interstate travel to 21-year-olds was based on some crash or some significant event that caused it, and apparently not. I looked, and it doesn't look like there was anything other than they just thought that that was an appropriate age to limit drivers from driving commercial trucks, so semis, dump trucks, things like that, across state lines. Now, there may be a few exceptions in the case of farming, and I'm actually going to talk about that here in a moment. But generally speaking, that is the rule. So, over the road trucking, for the most part, is not really available until you're 21. And for me, I didn't know that until just recently. And in fact, one I probably been giving bad career advice to people in the past, but I've had people who approached me and said, "I don't really want to go to college, but I don't know what I want to do. And so what would you recommend?" And I'm like, "Well, one thing you might consider doing is getting your commercial driver's license and just drive across the country and see the world, see the country, save some money, live out of your truck and just see some things and get some experience, and then you can, you know, settle down or decide what you want to do. And then, in today's age, especially where you can do so much learning and studying, through podcasts and audios, I'd be like, get on the road and drive, save your money, and learn some skills along the way. Well, unfortunately, that's actually not a valid option for most people until you're 21, which is kind of one of the main arguments I think against having it at 21, and we'll get to that in a minute. But there's a paradox about this because I think in 49 states, it must not be all states, allow 18-year-olds to get their commercial driver's license and drive in the state. And maybe even more perplexing to me, since this is a topic I talk about somewhat regularly, is like in Wisconsin, I think this is true in a lot of states. You don't have to have a commercial driver's license at all if to drive semi or straight truck if you're doing it for farm purposes. If you work for the farmer or you're the farmer, I believe here in Wisconsin, as long as you have a valid driver's license, so if you're 16 years old, you can drive semi on the road here in Wisconsin for farm purposes legally without a CDL. So it's all the more perplexing to me why an 18-year-old who actually has gone through trucking school, has tested, has a valid commercial driver's license, isn't allowed to drive in the state if they are, let's say, are licensed in Minnesota or Illinois or anywhere for that matter. And that's just a confusing thing to me. Um, the other thing too is, look at the state of Texas. It's huge. Like you can legally drive from one side of that state to the next. I think it is it 500 miles and be legal, but you can't drive 5 miles across the border. As far as I know. So it's a strange thing, and I don't know if states have the ability to change this. This is a federal regulation, and so my assumption is that states are not allowed to, let's say, like Illinois and Wisconsin can't necessarily reach an agreement to, let their drivers go back and forth. Otherwise, I would assume it would be happening, but I don't know that. I'm not a federal law expert, but that would be kind of be my assumption. So it's been around since 1986, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in changing it. Although there was so in I don't have the year on this. I think it's been within the last 5 years, maybe even more recently than that. There is apparently a safe driver apprenticeship pilot program, and it is something that's been tested, and it doesn't sound like there's been a lot of success or interest in it, but it allows certain people to drive interstate, so over the road, under a sort of a probationary basis, but you have to have another trucker with you, which I think in and of itself makes it very logistically difficult and probably cost prohibitive for everyone involved. But you have to like drive 240 hours, and then there's like another 160 hours, and you have to have someone in the passenger seat with you. And then those trucks have to be equipped with cameras and speed limiters and things like that. And so it sounds like not many people have signed up for that. And I don't know if that program is still going or if they plan to continue that, but that at least made some sense to try to, make it possible for 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds or 20-year-olds to be able to get over the road experience as opposed to just interstate. And I think one of the challenges with interstate, or I'm sorry, intrastate, so within a state, I suspect those jobs tend to go to maybe experienced drivers or people, uh, family, men and women with families, and want to be home in the evenings, on the weekends, whatever. Over the road trucking in many ways makes more sense for younger drivers before, let's say, they're committed to a family and have homes and things like that. So so I want to talk about kind of some of the pros and cons that I've seen offered for the rule that limits interstate travel to 21-year-olds, or in the rules that sort of favor changing into 18. So let's start with those favoring changing it to 18. So this, I think, is probably the biggest rule and biggest argument. And it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier about what I've, suggested to other people is you're losing potential drivers to other trades, maybe not college, but other trades, plumbing, electrical, carpentry, because most of those will hire people or train people right out of high school, and you can make pretty good money at it. And a lot of people aren't going to wait around 3 years to get their commercial driver's license if they can't find local driving. Maybe there's more opportunities for allowing the 18-year-olds to drive within the state, but I think it does greatly limit the scope of options that they have available to them. And like I mentioned, I think there's something to be said for letting those that are still young and don't have a lot of commitments in life to be doing the over the road stuff. Again, get some experience, see the country, save some money. The second argument, I think, for turning it over to 18, especially if it's, if it's an apprenticeship situation, is, what's a safer situation? Someone that gets their commercial driver's license at 21 but has no real experience and can legally just get in the truck, if they find someone to hire them and go over the road, versus someone that, let's say, is under the mentorship of an experienced driver, even if they're 18 or 19. So those are a couple of the arguments that I think weigh in favor of changing it. I think the strongest being is, if you want people to do this, I think you need to make it possible for them to realistically do it right out of high school. So here's kind of the arguments against. Here's the arguments for leaving it at, that age 18 or age 21, right? So there is plenty of science evidence that the what do they call it, the prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain that deals with risk assessment, doesn't really develop. Actually, it doesn't really develop until 25. So maybe even the 21-year-old isn't a real, maybe that's kind of arbitrary in and of itself. But we do know that there is additional brain development maturing that happens between 18 and 21 or 25. And so that, I guess, is probably one of the main arguments for leaving it as it is. The second one is, in this, I'm not sure if this is an effect or a cause, but a lot of insurance companies won't insure drivers under 21. This is something that my son is going through in his journey to find, kind of decent long-term employment as an 18-year-old, just now 19-year-old commercial driver. A lot of insurance companies just can't or charge a lot to insure those drivers. And I'm not sure if there's science behind it, if there's facts behind it, or if it's, again, based kind of on that assumption that younger drivers are less safe. And I don't know if that would change, if that insurability would change if they lowered the age legally to drive, interstate. This is one of the things I've said in my videos, as someone that has handled trucking cases and also, has experience driving and has driven commercial trucks. I tend to think that over-the-road trucking is probably safer overall than what I would call interstate or intrastate. I always get those mixed up. I think interstate over the road is probably safer for the most part than intrastate local driving, because that over the road stuff is, a lot of that is on freeways, on nice on ramps and off ramps and truck stops and warehouses and places that are designed for that traffic. A lot of local traffic, let's say you get hired by a company, a company that hauls rock and gravel, or a cement plant or something like that. You're constantly in and out of roads you've never been on before, driveways you've never been on before, places that may not even be equipped for commercial traffic, first of all. I personally tend to think there's a lot more dangers from that kind of local traffic, and more difficulties for the drivers for that kind of traffic than it is for over the road truckers. And so I tend to think that we, in many ways, ought to encourage over the road driving for the young drivers and save the, let's say, more difficult, demanding local type traffic that you tend to see in intrastate driving for maybe more experienced drivers. So that, to me, that seems a little backwards. And I think probably the third argument that I've seen raised for why it makes sense to limit interstate travel to 21-year-old drivers is it a good idea for 18-year-olds to be living out on the road, living in truck stops, all the kind of stuff that can, kind of go with that. I think there's some merit to that. Why not pair up a couple of 18-year-olds? Maybe that makes it worse. I don't know. But, have a buddy with them, have a, I don't know, something. But it seems to me that in today's age where, you know, I think 18-year-olds are doing a lot of things. You have cell phones, you have just so many more safety protections than maybe you did when you were, in 1980s when these rules came out. I think it maybe is something that we, really ought to evaluate. Um, Let me see if there's anything else here. Now, there is some data. I guess there is some general data, not necessarily limited to the trucking situation, but there's some general data that 16 to 20-year-olds have the highest crash rates. I think that's kind of across the board. Um, I No, that's everyone. That's not just commercial drivers, and probably most of those are not commercial drivers. I I think that I think if you have the maturity and the discipline to, get your commercial driver permit, go through trucking school, take the classes, take the exams, pass the driving test, all that. I think you've shown a level of maturity that most of your peers are not going to have. That I think those stats probably aren't very reflective of 18-year-old commercial drivers. And I don't know if there are any stats that are unique to commercial drivers, if they have any stats on the safety, the number of accidents that, let's say, a 19-year-old gets as opposed to a 21-year-old, but that might be something worth exploring. But that I think it's an interesting topic. It is sort of related to the other question that I handle a lot, which is should we do something about the ag exemptions, the farm exemptions for commercial driver's license? Um, I think I think as long as we allow untrained, unlicensed commercial drivers to drive commercial trucks if they're doing it for farming, I just don't see that there's a very strong argument for not allowing licensed and actually trained 18-year-olds drive interstate. And you could put parameters on it. I mean, we already have, hours of service and, mandatory breaks, all that with, you know, every over the road driver as it is. You could certainly set some additional restrictions. Maybe they don't drive at night. Maybe they don't drive through Chicago, or maybe it's you can drive within one state or two states of your home state. I mean, that there are lots of ways I think to skin this cat that seem to make more sense than the current prohibition on any interstate travel until you're 21. It seems like there's a driver shortage, and I think for a lot of drivers, and this is just anecdotal and talking to other drivers and hearing what they have to say, it takes experience to get to where you can make real money and maybe be in a position to be an owner operator. Well, if you can't start that journey realistically until you're 21, well then, that just puts you behind by 3 years in terms of getting that experience when you are, younger and have less commitments, less responsibilities. And then, so let's say by the time you're in your mid 20s, you've got quite a bit of experience under your belt. Maybe you've saved up some money and you're in a position to think about, settling down, getting married, having a family, buying a house, and those kinds of things. But right now, it doesn't seem like the system really supports that or encourages that. And so, let me know what you think about that. Let me know in the comments if you have strong feelings one way or another. Is it a good idea to make them wait until they're 21 to drive interstate? Should we reduce it? Maybe reduce it to 20 or 20, 19. Let me know what you think. I'm genuinely curious what people think about that, and especially if you're a trucker. If you're a trucker, I'd really like to hear what you have to say about it, because I think that would be, interesting input and data that maybe we can maybe we can look at some changes or expanding this pilot program or making it a little more accessible to people, things like that. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. I appreciate everyone who showed up on the live stream and contributed to the comments. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or ideas or things you'd like me to talk about in the future. Otherwise, I should be back next week, if not before, with another live stream. So I hope everyone is well. And until next time, everyone, have a good one.